A seasoned rancher was riding through the desert when he spotted something unusual under a dry, twisted tree, an old Mustang mare, abandoned by her herd, alone, weak, and on the brink of collapse. She had no chance of survival, but when he decided to help her, something completely unexpected happened. The herd that left her behind returned, but not in the way you'd ever expect. What happened next will change the way you see wild horses forever. The desert wind howled through the Nevada plains, kicking up dry dust and swirling it through the fading sunlight. The golden are cast long, warm shadows over the rugged terrain, stretching toward the distant mountains. Ethan Carter, a 52-year-old rancher, rode slowly atop his bay horse, Dusty, scanning the horizon for any stray cattle. He had been working this land his entire life, and there wasn't a canyon ridge or dry riverbed he hadn't ridden through at least a dozen times. But something caught his eye beneath the twisted limbs of a gnarled juniper tree. A lone Mustang mare, motionless, her coat nearly blending into the dusty landscape. Ethan pulled gently on Dusty's reins, narrowing his sharp eyes beneath the brim of his worn cowboy hat. Something wasn't right. A wild horse should never be alone. As he approached, his heart tightened in his chest. The mare was old, far older than most wild Mustangs survive in the wild. Her once proud golden brown coat was dulled with dust and age, her ribs faintly visible beneath her thinning frame. Her deep brown eyes, once sharp and full of spirit, now looked tired. Ethan dismounted, his boots crunching against the dry earth. Dusty let out a soft snort, sensing the tension in the air. Ethan moved slowly, not wanting to startle her. He had worked with enough wild horses to know that even a weak one could lash out if frightened. But she didn't move. She only flicked an ear in his direction, acknowledging his presence, but did not get up. She was too weak. Ethan knelt beside her, resting his forearm on his knee as he observed her more closely. Her breathing was slow but steady. There were no fresh wounds, no visible signs of trauma, but her body bore the marks of time scars from old battles, joints stiff with age. Then the realization hit him. She had been abandoned. Herds were brutal when it came to survival. If a Mustang grew too old, too slow, or too weak to keep up, the herd had no choice but to leave them behind. It was the harsh law of nature, one Ethan had seen play out many times before. Still, something about it felt wrong. She wasn't just old, she looked like she had been running. Ethan glanced around. The desert stretched out before him in all directions, endless and empty, no hoofprints, no tracks leading away, just silence. Then, for the first time, the mare lifted her head. Her dark eyes met his, searching for something, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his short, slightly white, straight beard as he made a decision. "I don't know how you got here, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from years of dust and sun. "But you're not dying out here alone." Dusty stomped a hoof, restless, but Ethan was already pulling a small canteen from his saddlebag. He poured some water into his palm and slowly extended it toward the mare. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she leaned forward and drank. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell Ethan that there was still fight left in her. Enough to tell him that she wasn't ready to give up just yet. But why had her herd left her? And more importantly, would they come back? Ethan didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was going to change everything. Ethan sat back on his heels, watching as the old Mustang mare carefully lapped the water from his calloused palm. Her tongue, rough and dry, flicked against his skin. For the first time, he noticed just how dehydrated she was. Every rib showed beneath her dusty coat, her flanks hollow from what must have been days without proper food or water. But she still fought her, which meant she had a chance. Ethan took a slow breath, his tanned face unreadable beneath the shadow of his cowboy hat. His short, slightly white-streaked beard itched against his skin as he considered his next move. He'd come across wild horses before, some lost, some injured, some left behind just like this, but something about this old mare felt different. She wasn't just abandoned, she had been running. Ethan scanned the horizon again. The Nevada desert stretched for miles, an endless sea of cracked earth, sagebrush, and towering rock formations. No sign of her herd, no fresh tracks leading away. No reason for her to be here except for one thing. she had survived this long. Mustangs were resilient creatures. Even the oldest of them wouldn't just lie down and give up. So what had happened? To her, Dusty, his loyal bay horse, let out a low snort, shifting impatiently. Ethan patted the gelding's neck absent-mindedly, his gaze never leaving the mare. Then she did something that made his breath catch. She tried to stand. Her front legs trembled as she pushed against the ground, nostrils flaring, ears pinned slightly backward as she struggled to lift herself. But her back legs buckled almost immediately, sending her back onto her side with a dull thud against the dry dirt. Ethan cursed under his breath. She was too weak. If she stayed out here another night, she'd never make it. He wasn't one for sentimental decisions, but there was no way he was leaving her to die alone in the cold desert night. He had an old corral back at the ranch somewhere she could rest, recover, and maybe even live out her last days in peace. But first, he had to get her there. The struggle to move her. Ethan pulled the coiled rope from Dusty's saddle, running his fingers over the thick, weathered strands. It wasn't the first time he'd had to move a downed horse, but it was different. She wasn't domesticated. She wasn't trained to trust. If she panicked and fought him, she could hurt herself even worse. He crouched beside her again, speaking in a low, calm voice. "I know you don't trust me, girl," he murmured, looping the rope loosely around her front legs. "But I'm not leaving you out here." Her dark eyes flicked toward him, something ancient and wise flickering in them. She didn't flinch at his touch. That was a sign. Ethan stood and moved toward Dusty, securing the rope to his saddle horn. He wasn't going to drag her. He just needed to help her get up. With a light click of his tongue, he gave Dusty the signal to step forward, tightening the rope just enough to give the mare some leverage. For a second, nothing happened. Then she pushed, her front hooves digging into the earth, muscles shaking with effort. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as she shifted her weight. Her back legs trembled under the strain. Dusty stepped forward another inch, and then she was up. She swayed dangerously for a moment, her legs wobbling beneath her thin frame. Ethan stepped forward, hands up, ready to steady her if she collapsed again. But she didn't. She stood, barely, her head lowering as she sucked in slow, ragged breaths. And that's when Ethan knew she wasn't done fighting yet. The long road ahead. Now came the part. They had a 3-mile ride back to the ranch, and she was in no condition to be ridden or led at a fast pace. Ethan unlooped the rope, keeping it loose enough that she could stop if she needed to. She took one step forward, then another. It was slow, agonizingly slow, but she walked. Dusty stayed beside her, his ears flicking between Ethan and the mare as if he knew she needed the encouragement. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. The desert night was closing in fast, and with it, the cold. Ethan pulled off his jacket, stepping toward the mare one last time before they set off. He placed it lightly over her back. She didn't flinch. Another sign. They had a long road ahead. But one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up on her, and he had a feeling deep in his gut that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The wind had shifted. The desert night was coming, bringing with it an unforgiving cold that could drop temperatures by 30 in just a few hours. Ethan adjusted his dusty cowboy hat, glancing toward the frail Mustang mare beside him. She was moving, but barely. Each step seemed to take every ounce of strength she had left. Dusty, his trusty bay gelding, walked patiently at his other side, ears flicking between Ethan and the mare as if sensing the tension. Ethan had worked with horses his entire life, and he knew this old girl was running on pure instinct now. It wasn't trust, not yet, but something deeper, survival, and she wasn't giving up. That was enough for him. The slow trudge through the desert. The 3-mile journey back to the ranch felt longer than usual as the golden hues of the sunset gave way to deep purples and blues. Ethan kept his steps slow, matching the mare's. He let the rope hang loose between them, just enough that she could stop if she needed to, but not so loose that she'd feel completely untethered. Every few steps, she hesitated. Each time, Ethan waited. He'd been around wild horses long enough to know that forcing them only made things worse. He had to let her choose to keep going. Dusty gave a quiet snort, shaking his head. Ethan chuckled dryly, patting the gelding's muscular neck. "I know, boy," he muttered. "Not our usual ride home." Dusty flicked an ear toward him but said nothing more. Ethan turned his attention back to the mare. He didn't know if she had ever had one, but the way she carried herself, even in her weakened state, reminded him of something ancient and wise. Sage, the name came to him without hesitation. Fitting, he thought. A horse that had seen things, survived things, just like the sagebrush that grew wild out here, tough, resilient, refusing to die even in the harshest conditions. "Come on, Sage," he said softly. Just a little farther. She flicked an ear but didn't stop walking. Shadows in the distance. As they neared the halfway point, something shifted in the air. Ethan felt it before he saw it, a presence, a tension. He turned his gaze toward the rocky ridges in the distance, his sharp eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. The last streaks of sunlight still clung to the sky, illuminating faint silhouettes against the horizon. Horses, not just any horses, wild mustangs. He counted quickly, 5 of them. One stood slightly ahead of the others, a massive black stallion with a thick, windswept mane. His muscular frame radiated authority even from a distance. Ethan didn't move, neither did Sage. She had seen them too. Her ears twitched, and her breathing hitched slightly. Ethan didn't know much about her old herd, but instinct told him these horses weren't strangers. The stallion snorted loudly, tossing his head. The others, a chestnut, a gray, and a beige, remained motionless behind him, their gazes fixed on Sage. And Sage, she didn't move. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. What was happening here? He had heard of mustangs abandoning the week before, but he had never seen them return like this. Were they watching her, waiting, or had they come back to finish what they started? Sage let out a deep breath, her ribs rising and falling rapidly, but she did not run. Ethan's grip on the rope tightened. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "You're safe. For now." The black stallion's decision. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the stallion tossed his head once more, snorted sharply, and turned. The others followed him without hesitation. No second glance, no acknowledgement. They had made their decision. Sage watched them go, her dark eyes unreadable. And then, for the first time, she chose her own. She turned back toward Ethan. She took a step and then another. The herd disappeared over the ridge, but Sage stayed. The home stretch. Ethan let out a slow breath, adjusting his grip on the rope. "Guess that settles that," he muttered. Sage was still weak, but her steps felt different now, more certain. The ranch wasn't far now, a place to rest and recover, and Ethan, for the first time in a long while, wasn't riding home alone. By the time they reached the ranch, the last sliver of sunlight had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only the glow of the stars and a rising half-moon to light their path. The desert night had settled in, and with it came a crisp, biting chill. Ethan Carter pulled his jacket tighter around himself, then turned his attention to Sage. The old mare stood at the entrance to the corral, unmoving. Her ribs rose and fell steadily, her legs stiff with exhaustion. She had made it, but barely. Ethan swung down from Dusty's back, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He ran a hand down the gelding's sweaty neck, murmuring a soft "good boy" before untying the rope that had loosely guided Sage. The entire way home, she didn't react, she didn't bolt. She just stood there, watching, waiting. Ethan sighed. "All right, girl, let's get you settled." Stepping into the unknown with slow, deliberate steps, he led her toward the corral, a spacious open pen with sturdy wooden posts and fresh hay laid across the ground. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Sage hesitated at the entrance, her ears flicking back, her muscles tensing. Ethan let the rope go slack, giving her the choice. She could run if she wanted. She could leave if she had the strength. But after a long, quiet moment, she did neither. Instead, she took a single step forward, then another, and finally, she walked through the gate on her own. Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. "That's it, girl. Take your time." He latched the gate behind her, but deep down, he knew if she wanted out, no fence would stop her. This was just borrowed time. The first night in a new place, Ethan filled a trough with fresh water, watching as Sage lowered her head and drank deeply for the first time since he found her. Her breathing seemed easier, steadier. She was still weak. He could see it in her stance, the way her legs trembled, slightly, but she had made it through the day. That was something. He grabbed a handful of alfalfa hay and tossed it in front of her. She sniffed it, but didn't eat. Not yet. Wild horses didn't adjust to captivity overnight. He'd refused food for days before finally accepting their new reality. He just hoped she had enough fight left in her to make it through the night. Ethan leaned against the corral, rubbing his short, slightly white-streaked beard as he studied her. She had survived out there for years. She had fought for her place in the herd. And yet, when the moment came, they had left her behind. His jaw tightened. That didn't sit right with him. He had seen Mustangs abandoned the week before, but something about this felt different. Why had she been alone in the first place? And why had the herd returned only to leave again? The desert watches. A soft breeze rustled through the corral, lifting strands of Sage's dust-covered mane. Her head snapped up suddenly, ears pricked toward the open desert. Ethan followed her gaze. The land stretched out before them, dark and endless, silent. The only movement was the gentle sway of sagebrush under the wind. But Ethan had spent enough nights out here to know something was watching, a feeling in his gut, the kind that kept men alive in places like this. He scanned the ridge beyond the ranch. Nothing. But Sage remained tense, nostrils flaring slightly. Ethan didn't like it. After a long pause, she finally lowered her head again. But Ethan knew what he saw. She wasn't looking at anything. A silent agreement. With a sigh, Ethan pushed away from the fence. "You get some rest, girl," he muttered. She didn't respond. She just stood there, breathing, thinking. Ethan grabbed his hat, dusted it off, and turned toward the house. But just before he stepped onto the porch, he looked back, and there she was, still watching him. Something passed between them in that moment, a quiet understanding, a silent agreement that neither one of them would say out loud. They weren't done yet. Not even close. The night had settled deep over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows. Across the land, Ethan Carter sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands, watching the corral in silence. The cold had crept in fast, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere. Sage stood in the same place where he'd left her. She hadn't moved much, hadn't settled, and hadn't lain down to rest. Her ears flicked, her body tense. She was waiting for something. Ethan exhaled through his nose, rubbing his short, slightly white-streaked beard. He'd spent enough years around wild horses to know when one was unsettled. And Sage wasn't just uneasy. She was on edge. Something in the dark. The wind stirred, kicking up loose dirt from the corral. Ethan watched as Sage lifted her head sharply, nostrils flaring. Then she turned her gaze toward the ridge, the same place she had been looking earlier. Ethan narrowed his eyes, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just the open desert, the distant outline of jagged rock formations, and the eerie stillness of the night. But his gut told him otherwise. Something was out there. He leaned forward, resting, his elbows on his knees. "Who are you looking for, girl?" he murmured. Sage didn't blink. She just kept staring. Ethan's pulse ticked up a notch. He'd seen Mustangs wait for their herds before. Some took hours to accept they'd been left behind. Others never did. But Sage wasn't confused. She knew something was coming, and Ethan was starting to believe her. A sound breaks the silence. Then, a distant sound carried through the cold air, a deep, low snort. Ethan stiffened. That wasn't Dusty. It wasn't Sage either. Another horse. His fingers instinctively brushed the handle of the old revolver strapped to his hip. "Out here, you didn't take chances. Not when something didn't feel right." Sage stepped closer to the fence. Her eyes locked onto the ridge. A gust of wind swept through the valley, rattling the wooden beams of the barn. The horses inside shifted uneasily, their hooves scuffing against the ground. And then, in the distance, a shadow moved. Ethan's grip tightened around his mug. It wasn't human. It was big and powerful, and it was watching them. The return of the herd. Then another shadow moved, and another. Ethan felt his breath hitch. 5 of them, the Mustang herd. They stood motionless along the ridge, their silhouettes barely visible. Beneath the pale moonlight, the black stallion stood at the lead, his head held high, his dark mane flowing in the breeze behind him. The two bays, the chestnut and the gray, watched in silence. Sage took a step forward. Ethan did too. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the black stallion snorted loudly, a deep, commanding sound. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the Mustangs turned and disappeared over the ridge. Sage lowered her head, not in defeat, in acceptance. Ethan exhaled, running a hand over his face. What the hell just happened? A change in her eyes. Sage turned back toward the corral, walking slowly. But when she looked at Ethan again, something had changed. The fear was gone. The confusion, the uncertainty, it had faded. In its place was something new, something certain. She had made her choice. Ethan took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well," he murmured, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Guess that means you're staying." Sage blinked, and for the first time since she arrived, she started to eat. The first light of dawn stretched across the Nevada desert, casting soft golden hues over the land. The crisp morning air carried the distant calls of coyotes retreating to their dens, while the scent of fresh hay and earth filled the air. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the corral, sipping a hot cup of coffee, watching Sage. For the first time since he found her, she wasn't standing stiff and alert. She was relaxed. She had spent the night in the corral, drinking and resting, and now she was eating. It was a slow process. Every few bites, she would pause, lifting her head to scan the horizon. Old habits, Ethan figured. But she wasn't looking for them anymore. Not for her herd. Not for the black stallion. She had made her choice. Ethan nodded. To himself, that was good. But now the real work began, earning her trust. Ethan wasn't in the habit of breaking wild horses. He didn't believe in that. If Sage was going to stay here, it had to be her decision. He stepped closer to the corral, resting his forearm on the wooden fence. Sage lifted her head, watching him carefully. "Morning, girl," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. She didn't back away. That was progress. He took another step, careful not to spook her. "You did well last night," he continued. "Must have been a long time since you got a full belly." Sage's ears flicked forward slightly. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small chunk of carrot. He didn't expect her to take it, but it was an offering. He extended his hand over the fence. For a long moment, Sage just stood there. Then she took a step forward, slow and cautious, but she moved. Ethan didn't blink. Then, just when he thought she might take it, she hesitated. A breath later, she stepped back, her eyes flicking away. Ethan exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. He didn't take it personally. Wild horses didn't trust easily. But the fact that she had even considered it, that was enough for today. Old scars, new worries. Ethan spent the rest of the morning tending to the ranch, feeding Dusty, checking the fencing, and making sure the cattle were still grazing where they should be. But regardless of what he did, his mind kept drifting back to Sage. By mid-morning, he decided it was time to take a closer look at her, not just at her habits, but at her injuries. Grabbing his vet kit from the barn, he headed back to the corral. Sage watched him approach, ears flicking slightly, but she didn't move away. "All right, girl," he muttered, kneeling beside the fence. "Let's see how bad that leg is." He didn't reach for her immediately. Instead, he just stood there. He let her see the tools in his hands, letting her understand that he wasn't a threat. Sage shifted slightly, uncertain. Ethan waited, then chest-stepped, flitting forward not much, just a few inches, but enough. He crouched beside her and finally got a closer look at the wound on her leg. The snare had done damage. The skin was raw, still red in some places, and the scabbing looked rough. It wasn't infected, but it could get worse if he didn't take care of it soon. "This will not be fun," he muttered. Sage stood still, and then, for the first time, she did something that caught him completely off guard. She lowered her head, not in fear, not in exhaustion, but in trust. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She was letting him help her slowly, carefully. He cleaned the wound. Sage flinched once but didn't pull away. Every movement had to be precise, gentle, but firm. By the time he was done, his hands were shaking slightly. He took a slow step back. Sage watched him carefully, then shifted her weight and tested her legs, still sore, still weak, but better. Ethan let out a slow breath, standing up straight. "You're tougher than you look, girl." Sage blinked, and then she took another step toward him. Ethan just stared, not because of the step itself, but because of what was in her eyes. For the first time, it wasn't just survival, it was trust, and that meant everything. "The storm is on the horizon." Ethan dusted off his hands, stepping away from the corral. The day was warming up, the sky a bright, endless blue. But in the distance, along the horizon, dark clouds were gathering. A storm was coming. And somehow Ethan had the feeling this wasn't just about the weather. The first rumble of thunder echoed through the desert as dark clouds rolled over the Nevada sky. The storm was coming in fast. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the corral, arms crossed, watching Sage. She was different now. In just a few days, she had gone from a frail, abandoned mare on the edge of death to a horse that stood tall, her presence commanding, her spirit unbroken. She was stronger. But was she meant to stay? The call of the wild, Dusty, his bay gelding, stomped his hooves in the barn, restless. Horses always knew when a storm was coming. Sage, however, stood completely still, ears pricked, eyes focused on something beyond the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze, and then he saw them, the Mustang herd. Just like before, they stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the storm-lit sky. The black stallion was there, and so were the two bays, the chestnut and the gray. They had returned, but this time they didn't just watch. The stallion stepped forward and let out a deep, powerful call, a challenge, an invitation. Sage's ears flicked forward, her entire body tensing with anticipation. She knew what this meant, and so did Ethan. The hardest decision. Ethan let out a slow breath, gripping the wooden fence as the wind howled around him. He had known from the start that she didn't belong here. Mustangs weren't meant to be penned up, no matter how much kindness they were shown. But the thought of watching her go, that wasn't easy. He had fought to save her, but now he had to let her go. His jaw tightened. "Go on, girl," he murmured. Sage didn't move. She just stood there, torn between two worlds. She looked at the herd, then she looked at Ethan. He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's all right, Sage, you don't owe me anything." A long pause. Then slowly she took a step forward, then another, and then she ran. Freedom. Ethan barely had time to unlatch the gate before Sage bolted. Her golden brown coat gleamed in the storm light as she surged forward, muscles moving with a power that had been hidden beneath exhaustion just days ago. She ran like she had never been caged, and when she reached the ridge, the black stallion didn't turn her away. He stepped aside, a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that she had earned her place once again. And just like that, they were gone. A quiet goodbye. Ethan stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. Then, with a slow sigh, he turned toward the barn. As he did, something caught his eye at the top of the ridge, barely visible against the storm-dark sky. Sage had stopped. She turned her head, looking back one last time. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then Ethan lifted his hand in a slow, quiet farewell. Sage let out a soft breath, and then disappeared over the horizon. Ethan exhaled, tipping his hat back. As the first raindrops hit the desert floor, he smiled because she wasn't lost anymore. She was finally where she belonged. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is let go. But for Sage, freedom wasn't just a choice, it was her destiny. Ethan saved her life, but eventually, she reminded him of something even greater. True strength isn't just about survival, it's about knowing where you belong. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes the most powerful bonds are the ones that can never be broken.